it's really hard because what we're seeing happen is sales are coming down, not for everyone, but for most people over the summer in Q3, number one. Number two, I think everyone knows labor's increasing. Number two, we're not seeing a huge increase in terms of like what food costs, right? We're not seeing a big change in like what a chicken costs now compared to what it did cost. It's going up, but not significantly. But what we are seeing is consumers fighting back on price increases. So there's only so much people can increase price.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Bar Business Podcast, where we help bar owners increase profits, attract loyal guests, simplify operations without burnout so they can finally enjoy their life outside the bar. I'm your host, Chris Schneider. In today's episode, we are going over benchmarking data again. So we did this about 3 months ago, and we're getting our benchmarking data from Starfish, which, as many of you are aware, is a partner of the podcast. So joining us today is Jordan Silverman. He is here because if you listen to the one we did a few months ago, I said, I probably should ask Jordan this a couple times. So I figured rather than me trying to figure everything out on my own, having Jordan here, having him give us some context and add his thoughts in, because he's looking at this data as much as I am, would be very helpful for all of you. So hopefully we get less conjecture and more reality than we had when we did this 3 weeks ago. But before we get into that, real quick, obviously we mentioned Starfish. That's one of our sponsors, but I want to mention our other sponsor real quick, which is Spot On. They provide a great POS option. So if you're interested in learning more about that, it's down in the show notes. But as I said, Jordan Silverman of Starfish is joining us today. And Starfish, I have mentioned this in the beginning of most podcasts, but they take AI data out of your accounting software. And I think now they're connecting with, I want to say 4 or 5 different ones. So QuickBooks, Restaurant 365, Xero, some other options there. And they use their AI to really dig into your numbers and find inconsistencies, changes, abnormalities, and then alert you of that. Starfish, I want to say, Jordan, you're just past your 1-year anniversary. Back. So that's exciting and that's fun. Yeah. And I saw on LinkedIn when you posted that, and I forget the exact number, but you had some number of hundreds of thousands of dollars that you've saved people so far.
Yeah, we've been really fortunate where customers use the tool, they like the tool, and it saves them money, which is awesome. Over the last 9 or so months, we've saved our customers over $400,000. That's at almost $500,000 now.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And we talked about this. If you have not heard the episode that Jordan and I did back, probably about 4 months ago now, when we first worked on a partnership and started talking about benchmarking data from Starfish, go listen to that. He goes into all sorts of detail about what the product is, how it works, and we really break that down. So that's there. Also, if you have not listened to it and you're curious about some of the background or some of the numbers we're referring to, there was an episode that came out right at the beginning of July that went over numbers for the previous quarter. So that may help give some context to something that we're saying seems a little odd. And so you can see where those numbers have gone a long time. And so, like I said, Jordan and I are just really going to jump in these numbers and discuss them. And full disclosure, we have discussed this a little bit before the episode, but not entirely. So we may have some disagreements. We may have some points where we're just kind of thinking out loud, but that is what data analysis is at the end of the day. So with that said, Jordan, before we get into the numbers, is there anything you want to add? Anything you want to talk about real quick?
Yeah, so I'll give the 30-second overview of Starfish, and then I'll talk about why we're building. Then I'll talk about why we're building benchmarks. So I've worked in the restaurant industry for the last 10 years on the tech side. What I noticed is almost every single restaurant or small business analyzes their costs the same way. They go down their P&L line by line, and they see how they're doing compared to last period. Or even worse, Chris, nothing at all. They just hope that things get better month over month. So what we're doing is automating that analysis. So we integrate, as you said, into accounting systems. We pull in the P&L, and then on a weekly basis, we email our clients proactively tasks or action items that show them step by step how to lower costs or increase revenue. So when we say that we've saved our customers over $400,000, what that means is we emailed them proactively. Here are some ways to lower your costs. They took those actions That is everything from food to labor to utilities to cleaning supplies and everything in between. And their costs actually went down because of it. So that's not in potential savings, that's in realized savings. Now, why benchmarking? First thing I'm going to say is we're going to dive into benchmarking a lot here. Benchmarks are meant to be directional. They are not meant to be to the penny. They're meant to be directional. When I was running my first business, I spent way too much money on things like legal and advertising and things that did not matter for my stage. And I wish I had someone telling me, hey, Jordan, you're spending too much on these categories for your stage, for your size, for your type of company. Slow it down a little bit. Focus on what matters. That's what the benchmarks are there to serve as a warning of your labor costs are too high, your management is too high, your utilities bills way out of whack for where it should be. So everything we're going to talk about today is based on my own need, and our customers are using it today as a directional beacon, a guide of where they should aspire to be and where they need to focus.
And I think that note on benchmarks is really important. One thing that I would add from my end on there is sometimes you're not like your business may be structured in a way that, okay, the average food cost is 30% and your food cost is 35%. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong, right? Benchmarks, to your end point, are indicators of the direction other businesses are going in and industry averages. So your model may be a little bit different than the industry as a whole, but 9 times out of 10, if you have a cost that far exceeds a benchmark, you have a problem.
Yeah. And listen, liquor has very different margins than wine and beer, for example. So it also completely depends on not only your concept type, but also your product mix. So depending on what you're selling, your P mix is potentially the number one driver of where you should be going from a benchmark standpoint.
Which is also why in other episodes, and Jordan, I don't think you and I have talked about this before, but I've talked about this with other people and on the podcast, where when we start talking about things like prime cost should be this, the most key thing that impacts your prime cost is your product mix, right? You can't just say prime cost should be 55%, because to your point, if you sell way more food in one quarter and way less beer, well, beer costs a lot less on a percentage basis than food generally.
Yeah. I won't forget it. So 10 years ago, I had my first job in restaurant tech. I was a customer success manager, helping a restaurant out, and it was a steakhouse. And they built their recipes. We got their cost of goods set up, and their steak place, they're running a 44% cost. And I said to him, like, hey, that's got to be closer to 30 because that's the industry average. This guy was super nice. He educated me. He said, no, Jordan, a pizza place might have an 18% cost or a 15% cost, but a steak place, 40% is actually really good. So the product mix, as you said, Chris, whether it's a restaurant or a bar, is everything for what it should look like.
And to that point on steaks versus pizza, and we'll get into this when we get into wine-specific numbers here in a little bit, but kind of a preview of what's coming up. Contribution margin versus contribution dollars.
Yeah. Amen.
Because that steak, yeah, it's a 40% cost, but if I'm selling it for $40, I made, $24? Versus that pizza I'm selling for $18, I'm not making $24 on that, right? Like I just can't.
Nope. Yeah, unless you live in New York City, then you can, but I understand.
For those of you listening from New York City, these numbers may not reflect your reality at all.
Yep.
Because there are certain outliers, whether it's on the major city end, right? The big market end where costs are way more expensive generally. There are also outliers on the rural suburban end. And that's so that everybody knows how we have this data divided when we go through and talk about major markets versus smaller markets, or major cities versus non-major cities, or urban versus suburban, rural, however you want to phrase that. And, on the rural end, if we get really sticks rural, well, your costs are higher, not because your costs are higher because you can't charge more than $5 for a Bud Light. If you can even get 5, right? Like there's just less elasticity in what customers will accept as a price.
Yep, totally.
So with all that preamble, let's go ahead and talk some numbers. So first thing I want to look at is net profit. And For those of you that listened in July, one of the things we talked about was that looking at net profit, we looked at top performers, and then we looked at averages across all of the Starfish data. And top performers quarter to quarter at that point had been pretty flat. Now we've seen kind of a marked decline among those top performers, going from 33% to 21% for those in urban areas, major cities, and going from 37% to 29.6% for those in suburban and rural areas. Now, when Jordan and I were talking about this beforehand, he had some insight into some of what is causing this, which I'll just go ahead and let you talk on why you think that is.
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting things that we're seeing is costs, as we said, are totally dependent on sales, right? So there are some regions and some areas where sales are really strong in Q3. So just to take a step back, we're going off fiscal calendar, right? So that is July, August, September. Okay, that's Q3, July, August, September, which for most of us is summer. So what we're seeing is a lot of these things are changing based on summer. So we're seeing somewhat consistently Q1 and Q2 are kind of the same. And then Q3 and Q4 are pretty different because of A, the weather, and then B, the holidays. So that's what we're seeing in terms of differences from a sales standpoint for Q3 and Q4.
And that makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about the major cities had on a percentage basis, a larger drop than kind of your suburban rural areas. And something Jordan and I were talking about, a lot of folks in New York City, they're not in the city as much as they can be in summer because it's hot and it's loud and it's annoying, and they would much rather go to the woods, to a beach somewhere, get out of the city. So those folks out of the city then do a little bit better sales-wise. Those folks in the city do a little bit worse. And the other thing too there that I would add on to what you said is that there are costs increasing across the industry. And the fact that the top performers have come down a little bit, in some ways, in my mind, just illustrates that the ceiling has moved a little bit lower, right? They're not necessarily doing anything worse. Just the sales overall were lower. So that ceiling on the percentage of profit moves a little low.
Listen, it's really hard because what we're seeing happen is sales are coming down, not for everyone, but for most people over the summer in Q3. Number one. Number two, I think everyone knows labor's increasing. Number two, we're not seeing a huge increase in terms of like what food costs, right? We're not seeing a big change in like what a chicken costs now compared to what it did cost. It's going up, but not significantly. But what we are seeing is consumers fighting back on price increases. So there's only so much people can increase price. So those three things of sales kind of going down a little bit over the summer, consumers hitting their ceiling in terms of what they're willing to pay, and then wages, hourly, management, everyone going up. It just brought that ceiling, as you said, down.
Absolutely. But what's interesting to me is if we look at averages, so not just the top performers, but if we look at the average across everyone that's using Starfish that you have on there to get data from, we're seeing in major cities, we were at 6% last quarter. Now we're at 5.1. So a little lower, but not a really big change at all. Versus rural suburban areas, we were seeing 9% last quarter. Now we're seeing almost 14. So that's a pretty significant growth in that part of the market when it comes to average bottom line. And my inclination, it just goes back to that seasonal tourism. It goes back to people going on vacation to these more rural suburban areas and spending
people
more
getting
money
out of the major cities. That's it. I agree with you entirely.
Well, cool. That makes it easy to have the conversation.
Yeah, totally agree with you.
So that kind of gives you guys all the framework of where we are looking at net profit. And what we're going to do now, we're going to go through some individual costs and look at them. And in the last episode that we talked about benchmarking and went over the data, the first thing we looked at after net profit was occupancy costs. Occupancy costs because they're relatively, they have variance season to season, but they're flatter than most things that we deal with in a lot of ways. So it's a good indication for me kind of where sales are looking. And also because when we start dealing with energy price increases and some things that have been going on, that can be a big spike that is hard from our side as a bar owner to really price in and play with. Because to your point, Jordan, if chicken isn't getting more expensive, inflation has hurt us, but we've also kind of had grace from our customers, because if I charge you more for bacon and you go to the store and bacon's twice the cost it was 4 years ago, you understand.
Yeah.
Right? Like the customers can have logic in their own brain that makes that work.
Completely.
Whereas if our energy prices go up 20% and then our prices go up 5% to account for that, there's a little bit more cognitive dissonance with the customer, and they can't draw those lines together quite as easily.
You're not passing that along.
No, you're not. Yeah. That is true. So looking at occupancy costs, when we look at major cities, we saw the first quarter we looked at 6.4, 11% last quarter. Now we're up to 14. And I will say some of that is an increase in rent as a percentage, obviously. Also, some of that's an increase in utilities. And then when we look at non-major cities, we saw 4.9 first quarter, 11% second quarter, and we're seeing 11% again third quarter. So it's not a huge change in either regard. And my thought process as I was starting to look through this is that, well, 11% to 14% for a major market could be as simple as it's been really hot this summer and people are running their AC. What are you thinking, Jordan?
So first thing I'll say is we are seeing that rent is just a larger line item in major cities to start with. That's the first thing I'm going to say.
Of course,
in major cities, your rent cost, not just dollar-wise, but just as a percent of sales, as a percent of cost, is higher in a major city. So I expect, and the data kind of shows this, occupancy costs to be slightly higher simply because of that.
Mm-hmm.
What's been really interesting to look at is we are seeing customers not only increase their electricity, their gas, their utilities year over year, but almost 2 to 2.5x compared to what it is in the winter and spring.
Wow.
So what we're seeing a lot of is utilities bills up somewhere between like 10 and 20% year over year. But sometimes that could be literally 2x from what it was in Q1, beginning of Q2. So when you're looking at utilities, I always recommend to my customers, that's one of those that I always recommend looking at year over year, not period over period, because the jump from May to June to July to August is really significant.
Now, this just occurred to me as you were talking, and I don't know if you have any insights on this piece, but one of the things that we've been seeing going around, especially in coastal states lately, has been an idea that we want to get away from gas appliances and to electrical appliances. And I don't know if you have any data from your customers, if they've done that, or because in theory, if you're buying more electrical equipment, your utility costs should go up, because electrical equipment almost always costs more to run than the same piece of equipment on natural gas.
Yeah. I don't have the data, but I can tell you qualitatively, we are having a fair amount of customers look into it, but getting scared off by the upfront costs.
Which makes a lot of sense to me.
So I don't have the data, but what I can tell you is like from my qualitative conversations with clients, they are looking at this and they have decided maybe next year. That's the common theme, right? And I feel like that's a very easy thing to say in restaurants, right? Maybe next year. Maybe when we got more profit, maybe next year. But I'm not seeing a lot of people actually make it.
Well, that'll be interesting to see if that happens wholesale. And I think we're looking at the potential in multiple states and potentially at the federal level down the road to have some regulation regarding what can be gas, what can't, and kind of measuring that, because obviously that's going to have a huge impact on utility bills.
Yeah,
but
totally agree.
Who knows when that will happen or what will happen, or predicting politics is not a game that I'll predict bar and restaurant numbers all day long.
Yeah,
predicting politics is not statistically relevant enough.
I think that's probably smart. Yeah.
So the other thing too, just to wrap up this rent utility. So we saw the increase in major cities. That makes sense. In non-major cities, that percentage stayed the same. Now, everything we're talking about with heat and electrical use, obviously that that doesn't matter if you're in New York City or in upstate New York, right? Your weather is basically the same, and your utilities are going to go up the same amount from AC usage.
Yeah.
Do you think that the non-major cities have stayed more consistent just because they've seen an increase in sales where the major urban areas have seen stagnant or decreasing sales due to summer?
It's a really good question. I don't know, is my honest answer. Have not dug into it yet, but I'm not surprised what the numbers say based on the conversations I have with people. But I don't know what the driver is. And I'm trying to figure that out just the same as you, because I honestly don't know what the main driver is.
Well, that works because I have no clue either.
Yeah.
That's why I asked.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah. It's,
and that's something when you're listening to this to think about as a bar owner, right? Between Jordan and I, we have a lot of experience doing data analysis for bars and restaurants. We have some of the best data that exists right now that we're talking about. And even with all of that working in our favor, we don't always have the answer, right? Some of this is there's just not the industry volume of data and the academic studies and things that give us clear-cut answers.
Yeah. And it's also hard because, like, my dream, and this is never going to happen, but, like, how great would it be if just, like, every single bar had the same chart of accounts and every single bar booked things the same way? Because then you can really benchmark, right? But utilities is different for some people than others. Some people split out gas and electricity. Some people it's all just in utilities. So sometimes it's rent plus common area maintenance. Sometimes it's rent plus percentage. So, like, what I would say is use these directionally as we talked about at the beginning, and then just look for your business, your focus on occupancy cost should be year over year. That's my recommendation.
And I definitely with the utilities, to your point, the year over year is so much better than month to month because the weather changes and what you use changes.
Yep.
So getting out of that occupancy cost, rent, utilities space, let's get into prime costs, food, beverage costs here a little bit.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really interesting on prime costs. So the first quarter we looked at this, major markets, we were looking at about 65%. Non-major markets, we were looking at about 78%. Those both dropped last quarter to 56 for major markets and 53 for your suburban rural markets. And then this quarter, analyzing it, it's gone pretty much to where it was first quarter. So it looks like we had a dip in spring for whatever reason. And we can speculate on that in a little bit. But essentially where we are now and where we started the year seem to be basically the same from what I'm looking at.
Yep.
So with the decrease last quarter, I mean, I'll be real honest, the first thing that occurred to me, because Jordan supplies the benchmarking data, but I have to do math, like for prime cost, because I'm looking at individual percentages. The first thing that occurred to me was that I did my math wrong last time. And because it seems odd to just create, they both dipped and now they're both back almost exactly where they were. Other thought that occurred to me is it could be a volume thing and just seasonality in the market. So I'll just ask you, do you think I did my math wrong or do you think it's a seasonality thing?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. I think it's a seasonality thing for a couple of reasons. Number one, like, one of the best ways to lower prime cost is to increase revenue. I know that sounds counter, but like food cost is as a percent of sales, but a lot of times your labor cost can stay flat even while you increase sales, right? That's not something most people understand, right? Is that there's a bare minimum. You probably need one front of house, one back of house at a minimum for your bar. Ideally more as you grow, but at least one front, one back. But your sales might not justify that. Or you've got 2 and 2 and your sales aren't there. So you can increase. So number one, I think it's a volume thing. One of the other ideas I have, and I've just started talking to customers about this, is as college is in session, there's an abundance of workforce that a lot of restaurants can tap into that might not be as high paying as a full-time employee. And over the summer, they go away from campus and they do other things. So that's my other ongoing thought is potential lower labor costs for some of these people.
You know, that's a thought that had never occurred to me, but I bet you it plays out. Because I'm even thinking like I live in the middle of nowhere, but the county over is Indiana University. And there's a huge difference between what's going on there, say now, right? We're in the middle
Mhm.
of fall semester. It's football season. There's all this craziness versus a few months ago where I could literally drive over there on Friday night and park on any street I wanted. I'll be real honest. I like Bloomington, but I like it a lot more in the summer because all the college kids are
Of
gone.
course. Yeah.
And as locals, we can go enjoy it. So I had not even thought about college employment on a massive enough scale to move the industry, but it makes sense.
Yeah. It's like such a huge employer of college age kids. And so many kids in college work at restaurants, work at bars.
Well, I also wonder, and again, this is just us conjecturing because there is no data on this, but
Yeah. No.
we know post-COVID that a lot of veterans in the industry retired, right? I haven't seen any studies anecdotally, like everyone is agreeing on this point.
Yep.
And so the average years of experience have to be way lower now than they used to be. That also means that there are a lot more jobs available for those college kids because there's a lot fewer lifetime bartenders, lifetime servers out there. So, yeah, I don't know what that means at the end of the day, but
It's very interesting
it
now. Me
can
neither.
explain
It's
some of
just,
this prime cost.
yeah, I'm excited to see if that continues or how it looks.
I am too. It's that's one of the fun things. And Jordan and I, obviously, for those of you listening, are pretty nerdy when it comes to the numbers. But it's interesting to watch things develop. And the level of this data is, to Jordan's credit, something that doesn't really exist elsewhere. I mean, there are more tech companies now that are kind of do some kind of benchmarking. But if you think back, what, 5 years ago, no one had data like this.
No. No. Yeah.
And for the record, and this is not just because Jordan's a partner of the show and I like him personally, but his data is, out of everything I've seen from anybody, probably the best out there as far
Thank
as
you.
consistency and level of detail.
Appreciate that.
Right? Because that's one thing, and we're going to go into some of the details here, because in the last episode when we talked prime cost, we just talked about it generically. Here, I want to actually talk food, beer, wine, liquor, and labor real quick. But a lot of the benchmarking that folks get access to doesn't have that ability to get to that level. So we talk about these kind of, 55% prime cost. Well, okay, I can't do anything with that if I have a
Yeah.
prime cost benchmark across the
Totally.
industry.
Yep.
So with that said, let's get into the specifics a little bit here. So with food, and we didn't do these last time, so I don't have comparisons, but I do have numbers. Food-wise, we're seeing 40% food cost in major markets, 25.5% or 25.7% in smaller markets. I took this solely to mean, and we'll measure this so that next quarter we can talk about a comparison. But I think that, in my mind, that difference, we're talking about, 15% higher food costs in major markets, is probably largely due to quality of food. Now, I don't know your customer base well, so I don't know if that's true, but we were talking before the show, if you're selling a steak, if you're selling a really high-end porterhouse that you're charging $50-$60 for, a 40% cost on that is very reasonable. Versus if you're selling French fries, you're not getting a 40% cost on your French fries and surviving as a bar. So I think some of it's quality of food. And then just because, like where I live, and we were talking about this before we started recording as well, where I live, there are price ceilings just because I live in a rural area and people are not going to spend that much, right? If you tell somebody $7 for a side of fries, they're going to laugh at you and you'll be out of business next week in New York City if you say $7 for a side of fries. I'm sure there are some restaurants where people would consider that a really good deal.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
do you think that's just a market difference in those two numbers, or do you think there's something bigger there?
I think those numbers will consolidate in future quarters. I think they'll come closer to each other. I think number one, it has to do with sales, like we talked about, right?
Mhm.
Sales are a cure-all. So we talk a fair amount with like the distributors, Cisco, GFS, etc. And one of the things that they're pushing really hard is the best way to lower prices is based on drop size. Now, for those of you that don't know what I mean when I say drop size, I'm talking about the dollar amount of the delivery that you are getting. The bigger the delivery, the lower they'll price it because they don't want to send a truck back and forth multiple times. That is a distinct advantage to non-major cities because major cities, the hardest thing is space and storage. So because of that, it's lower drop sizes, more frequent deliveries. As opposed to the non-major cities, they can get less frequent deliveries and bigger drops.
That's interesting because that had never occurred to me. Again, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because I mean, say I can get a 25% discount if I order every other week as opposed to twice a week. In New York City, if I have a 2 chest freezers down a flight of stairs in the basement, that's all I've got, right? I could get the biggest deal on fries in the world, but I can't store them.
Yeah.
And in I was working with a client of mine that's up in Indianapolis, and we were talking, and she's like, "Yeah, I think I might just put a freezer out back."
A client that does that.
Right. And so, but it's the ability to put a freezer out back is great if you have dirt. But if you're in New York City,
yelled at multiple times by his landlord also, though, right? Like, there's certain things you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And yes, sometimes you have no choice and you accept the, ask for forgiveness. No.
Yeah.
Okay, whatever it is. But yeah,
for sure. And that's, that's another, it doesn't play into this conversation as much, but that's another key difference when you look at urban versus more rural suburban markets. In an urban market, in New York City, I don't know how many bars and restaurants own the dirt they're on, but I'm guessing it's, maybe a handful, maybe.
I would guess very few, yeah.
Right, because some family owned the same bar since 1850 or something, so
Correct.
They own the building.
Yeah.
Versus, if you get into rural America, if you get in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska, it's closer to like 100% of people own the dirt. Because, in the same way, their family might have owned the dirt since 1850, but it's a lot more dirt and they can build on it whatever they want.
Correct.
So that's food costs, right? Where we're seeing it higher in the major markets than the non-major markets by a significant point. What was interesting to me, beer costs, major markets, we're looking at 18.75. Non-major markets, we're looking at 16.7. So we're almost identical, right, on beer costs. I was trying to figure out non-major markets, we're a little lower cost percentage because usually, and I already mentioned this, but non-major markets, you just can't charge as much. And my thought was rural folks are more likely to drink a Miller Lite or a Coors Light or a Bud Light than a craft beer. And you get in the cities and they're selling a lot more high-end craft beer than they are Miller Lite.
Yeah. Totally agree with that.
So do you think that's the entire explanation of that margin difference there?
Honestly, I think it's such a close margin that they're probably pretty similar, right? I would assume that in major cities, they're getting better margin, but they're just selling less of it and different types. So yes, I think that's like pretty much it.
And what was interesting is moving on to wine, we saw almost the opposite in wine. Major markets, a 41% wine cost. Suburban rural markets, a 58% wine cost. So we have a 16-point higher cost in non-major cities. My brain, first thing I went to was, the percentages are so high because we're looking at a lot of people selling bottles.
Yep.
Right. So they're not getting 4x what the bottle costs, like they were just selling it by a glass. They're selling bottles and they're accepting more contribution dollars in exchange for less contribution margin, the same way you would on a steak. But I think those 16 points in my head, I looked at that, that's because you can't sell the stuff for the same amount, right?
I agree with you. It's just the margin that's built into a recipe, in quotes, right? Like, that's it. Totally agree with you.
Yeah, because
you can take a $5 bottle and you can sell it for $30 in a major city and $15 in a non-major. Yeah,
exactly. Because there's no way. Well, I mean, maybe every once in a while in the town I live in, you might be able to sell a $250 bottle of wine like 2 or 3 times a year.
Yeah.
Right. Versus you go to Miami or LA or a place like that, they're selling $250 bottles of wine at every table all night, every night.
Yep. Totally agree.
Now, what struck me as interesting was that we see, like beer, a much closer gap when it comes to liquor.
Yes.
But that liquor costs were actually higher than I expected them to be. Sure. So with major markets, we're looking at almost 30%, 29.4. And with non-major markets, we're looking at a third, 33.33. And, if you listen to me talk on the podcast, if you listen to any of the consultants, any of the cocktail folks, any of the bartend training folks, we're all going to say that number should be around, 20-ish. New York City, a lot of those guys will argue 18. You'll hear me a lot of times say 22, 23, 24, because I'm thinking, in those rural communities, you're not getting there. But 30% seems hot. Do you have any idea why 30% would be where we're sitting on that?
So I'm going back to my market man days now. Okay. So before I worked at Starfish, before I started Starfish, I worked at a company called Market Man, which is an inventory software for bars and restaurants. And we noticed over the summer a pretty big team exchange in terms of liquor, where people stopped ordering drinks neat or on the rocks and started ordering actual cocktails in the summer.
Okay.
And a lot of times cocktails have more ingredients and in turn might have a higher cost. That's my initial thought, but I don't know.
I could definitely see that being the case, because one thing that people, and I've talked about this before, but one thing that a lot of times people forget to do is factor in things like garnishes and mixers, right? And a Scotch neat costs you the exact cost of the Scotch. A Mai Tai or a Sex on the Beach or a Rum Runner, I mean, those, you have, in some cases, more money in everything that's not booze than the booze itself. And so that would make a lot of sense to me. And I've always noticed the uptick of, what I would call summer drinks in summer or beach drinks when you're going to the beach. But I had not thought about it in that way.
And what I would say is, like, so many of the customers that we see, they are, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I think it's just a fact, but so many are pricing their menu based on costs and their goal profit margin versus what the surrounding demand is. I'm not saying what's right or wrong. I just think you and I can probably agree. A lot of people get an Excel or a tool like Market Man or Mies, type in their recipe and say, I want this % margin, so this is the profit. This is the retail price. But when you're forgetting things in the recipe or when you're not doing the right amounts, it's a whole different ballgame.
And the other thing too that could be at play here is because that difference between what I would say was like more of a winter cocktail and a summer cocktail is quite a bit on the ingredients end. There may be less price elasticity in summer than winter when we're looking at different cocktails, right? Because if I have a cocktail menu that's all winter drinks and they're all $12 to $15. Yeah. And then here comes summer, here comes, I don't know, maybe we're talking about a place in like Virginia or North Carolina on the beach, right? Because winter is really winter there, but summer is wonderful beach weather. Yeah. And so that summer comes around and I'm still stuck in my customer's mind in that 12, 15, maybe I could push 15, 16, but I can't change from a $12 to $15 cocktail menu to a $17 to $20 cocktail menu.
Agree. Yeah. Totally agree.
And by the way, anyone listening, if you go in the show notes, there's a thing on the very top that says text the show. If you think, because I am curious, if you think anything we're saying is just completely wrong, or if we have something of conjecture and you're going, yeah, that happened to me, that's true, let me know.
Love that.
Because the more information we have, we'll share it on the podcast and let everybody know, hey, Jordan and I talked about this and we were just dead wrong. Or right. I mean, hopefully we're right, but we could be very much wrong. But also just because it gives some more validity. And everyone, the only way to look at the industry and benchmarks is to get as much information as we can from everywhere and try to synthesize it together.
Yeah, very well said.
So last piece of prime cost to talk about, labor cost, which I know you and I have a lot of different thoughts here. And we're looking at about 33% in major markets, about 30% in non-major markets. To me, that is really, really close together. I don't really see any statistical difference there, especially given that, well, to put it simply, in Indiana, you can still pay $2.13 as a tipped minimum wage. There aren't many states where that's true. I think it's like 15 now, or it's 15 or less. But there are a number of states where that's true, and those are not major markets. And a lot of the major markets, you're dealing with minimum wages that are $20-ish. So it's a huge difference in labor cost. It's, 10 times as much. So those numbers being close, that I'm reading is pretty much the same. What are your thoughts on the labor side?
So we are not seeing a major difference between where you are based. What we are seeing a major difference, though, is year over year. That's where we've been seeing a significant increase. So if you look at what percent of your sales went to labor this time last year compared to where it is now, that's where we're seeing a pretty significant increase. But you're correct. We are not seeing major labor cost differences based on location, which is really interesting.
Well, it is particularly interesting because when you think about saying, okay, well, this business's cost for front of house labor is 20 times what this other business is at, and then the percentages come out the same. Obviously, that goes back to sales, right? Because in New York City, I can sell a lot more than I can in, I don't know, the middle of Arkansas. There's just a bigger market. There's more money. There's more people. There's more customers. You said, oh, year over year, you've seen a big jump, and I don't have those numbers. So
Yeah.
can you quantify that a little bit?
Yeah. So we are seeing, let me just pull this up. So we are seeing on average a like 30 to 40% increase year over year.
That is huge.
Huge. Really significant.
Do you have any idea about the drivers of that increase?
All we are able to see from a Starfish standpoint is the payroll journal entries. I don't see anything more than that. What I can tell you is that the increase is happening across the board, but the number one place it's happening is hourly labor. Management wages are increasing. We're seeing management wages up about 10 to 15% year over year. So management wages are up for sure. But the hourly labor is the majority of the increase that's happening year over year.
Which makes me wonder if it's not just, and we talked about this a little bit earlier on today, but if it's not just a change in the labor market and the fact that a bunch of people left during COVID and we have to replace them and it's harder to get people to do the job for what people used to accept for.
Correct. Yeah. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about today, and it's not directly related to labor, but it's this like very weird wrinkle is it doesn't matter if you're a restaurant or a bar, if you serve any type of food, the third-party delivery push is having a significant impact on margins. Significant impact. So that's the other thing we are seeing. And this heavily skews towards major cities, where major cities are seeing a lot higher percentage of sales come from third party, especially year over year. So what's interesting is like COVID hit, third party spiked to almost 100%, right? Then post-COVID, everyone wanted to start going to restaurants. Everyone wanted to eat out. And now we're seeing third party start to tick up again with the back to office.
That is really interesting. And that's something, I mean, full disclosure about where I live. Uber does not exist here. DoorDash does not exist here. Like there is zero delivery where I live. So I'm not always
not even Domino's. Not even Domino's.
There is the only two chain restaurants in my entire county are one Subway and one McDonald's.
That's wild. Okay.
I mean, it's when I say I live in the middle of nowhere, I mean it, right?
Yeah,
like
you're kidding. Yeah.
And the McDonald's and the Subway are 1/3 of all chain businesses that exist in the county. Like it's
Here you go. Heard.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I don't see that. But with that increase in delivery, with the back to office, that would make a lot of sense, especially on food costs and indirectly, potentially even labor cost, right? Because if you're doing a whole bunch of delivery, you have to have more kitchen staff.
Yes.
And you're doing that at a much lower margin than if you were serving it in the front.
Yeah. And we're seeing people try to get unique with it. Where like we're seeing more back of house than front of house. We're seeing people try to add like back of house specifically for catering or wholesale orders, trying to get unique with like, what are the revenue streams and how do I fulfill those revenue streams?
And that makes a lot of sense. And that's something that I've talked about some, but it's finding that balance can be exceedingly difficult.
So hard, Chris.
Right? Because you need the revenue,
so hard.
But you can't let your delivery orders impact your guests, and you can't let your delivery orders give people a bad impression of your food because you sold them fries to go and fries suck.
Yep.
Deliver. It's that's just it's a rough space.
Yep. Yeah.
So, wow. Jordan and I have been talking for quite a while about numbers. So if you're still with us, good job hanging out. And hopefully this has given you guys a whole bunch of insights on what's going on. Now, just my key takeaways, and then Jordan, I'll let you give yours. We're seeing the top performers not do it quite as well. But on average, it seems like the industry is chugging along pretty well. We have a lot of headwinds, I would say, whether it's labor, delivery, which I hadn't thought of before to Jordan's last point, or just changes in seasonality for summer. We had some of that. the seasonal changes should go away, but there are definitely some headwinds against the industry. That being said, from looking at the numbers, to me, this is not they don't look bad. I wouldn't say they look particularly promising either. I would say it's kind of just a neutral situation. Jordan, what would your key takeaways?
So I think first thing I would say is look at your business specifically and look at your history. And whether that is through Starfish or QuickBooks or Excel, doesn't matter. Look at your history of sales and log into your POS and look at the history of what you sold, because the best thing you can do is get ahead of seasonality, like Chris is saying. So you can count on, based on history, if your sales are going to increase or decrease in some. You can see if your P-mix is going to change and you're going to sell more cocktails than shots. You can see all of that in your data. So if you do it manually, just go to QuickBooks or Excel. If you want us at Starfish to do it for you automatically, great. That's the first thing. Look at the historical information. The second thing I would say is labor is increasing. The cost of labor is increasing. You need to find innovative ways to lower your costs, because I don't, and Chris, please tell me if you disagree, I don't see food, liquor, beer, wine decreasing in costs anytime soon. I'm not saying it's going to continue increasing, but I don't see it decreasing in costs anytime soon. So if your food and beverages, if your F&B is staying the same and your labor is going up, you have two options. Option number one, your profit margin goes down, and nobody wants that. Option number two is start to look in the nooks and crannies. Start to look at your chemicals, your paper items, your utilities bills. Really start to be strategic about where you can save and spend money. So I think those are my two big takeaways is benchmarks are here for directional, but look at your business and your business history. And then number two, look for any savings you can, because if you can stack $100 here, $200 there, $1,000, it makes a huge impact. Every dollar you save is a dollar of profit.
That is so true. And that's something, as you were saying that, I was thinking back when I owned bars, and I would spend hours and hours figuring out, okay, wait, if I do this, that saves me $500 a month. And you go, well, why just spend 10 hours figuring out how to save $500 a month? Well, that's $6,000 a year. And if it's profit, right, that's going, and I own the bar myself, that's straight to my pocket. That's my vacation money. And so your point about look in the nooks and crannies, look at this stuff that we didn't talk about today. Because we talked about the big picture items, the numbers that everybody really cares about. Look at the stuff we didn't talk about. And if labor is increasing, which it is, we can't argue that. That's how you can offset that.
Yeah. I want to tell a quick story on this. So we had one of our customers, one of our customers just had their first 2 months of profit in the last 18 months. First 2 months of profit. And when I say they're looking in the nooks and crannies, they figured out that by switching gloves, they can cut their glove cost by a tenth. So let's say it's not $10. Let's say it's $10. It's now $1. Mm-hmm. They figured out that if they change their to-go bags from color to black and white, 40% savings. A nickel in every bag, for example. So don't just think about your primes. Your primes are where you start, but look in every single place you can, because that's where you'll make real money.
Well, and on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up. So Jordan, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciated it. It was so, I think, much better and much nicer to the numbers and Starfish to have you here, just because rather than me just speculating, you were able to provide some context and some insight. Plus, you talk to different people than I do. So it was really fun, I think, to come at it from two different angles and to really dive into kind of what's gone on the last quarter and what that means for the industry. For everybody listening, if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you like, subscribe, leave a review, all that stuff that everyone tells you to do that you should do. And with that, everybody, I hope you have a great week and we will talk again later.
Thanks for listening to the Bar Business Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Check out our website at barbusinesspodcast.com and join our Bar Business Nation Facebook group for more strategies and tips.